Hi, thank you so much for coming tonight. It really means a lot to me. I know it means a lot to my family, and it really honors the memory of my dad. As we started to think about what to do at the funeral, I knew I wanted to share some stories about my dad and about how much he means to me. And I just knew that if I tried to do it where I was actually standing in front of you, I wouldn't make it through it. So I chose to do it in a video. I'm here actually in the house that we're in the process of building for my parents next door to my house. So I hope you can bear with me as I tell a few stories about my dad tonight. Even though we knew that my dad was sick and had been sick for a while, and we knew that his life was going to come to an end at some point, this week was a lot harder than I expected it to be. But it was also amazing in a lot of ways that I didn't expect as well. So much support, so many people praying for us, for our family, so many people offering to help, and I just want to thank each one of you for that support. It really means a lot to me. It meant a lot to my family this week as well. For any of you tonight who only knew my dad for the last 13 months, my dad was very different the last 13 months of his life, and he really missed a lot. So I want to kind of fill you in on a few of the things that happened before the last 13 months. From a very young age, I came to understand and believe that my dad was indeed the greatest dad in the world. And I want to tell you a few stories that helped me come to that conclusion. When I was about 3 years old, we were living in a rental property, and my dad had purchased some property to build a house. And instead of building a house the traditional way, he went and bought a house that had been condemned. And the reason it had been condemned is because it was underneath the water level of a proposed dam that the county was building, so it had to be demolished. So they were willing to sell this house to my dad for $1. The only trick was you couldn't live in the house where it was. You needed to move it to a new location. So what my dad did is he took his chainsaw and he came to the house and he cut it into manageable pieces and loaded it with a crane on the back of a flatbed truck, and he relocated the house to the property that we owned. And then he reassembled that house, even to the point of reassembly where he took the individual shingles off of the original house and put them back one at a time on the new house. So as a young kid, when you see your dad doing these kinds of things, it makes sense that you would come to the conclusion that I came to, that my dad was the greatest dad to ever live. Another memory that I have of my dad is that he used to sit down and read out loud to us at night as kids. And I can remember many books that he went through. But even this week, in talking to my mom, she told me that my dad, in the course of our childhood, read upwards of 500 different books to us out loud. And these books and that time with my dad really made a difference in my life. And it's another reason why I came to this conclusion that my dad was the greatest dad in the world. Something that happened a little later in life, when I was about 12 years old, my parents decided to go on a really big trip. It was a trip all across the United States, and so they got everything ready. We took off in the springtime, and we were out on the road for 3.5 months. And the goal of that trip was to see the rest of the country, to experience American history, and to go to the sites where American history actually happened. So this was an amazing trip. It held a lot of memories for us as a family, and it was a real something that we look back on as a real special experience, and something that I didn't know any other kids that got to do something like that. So again, reinforcing my belief that my dad was the greatest dad in the world. Despite all that my dad had done for me, I really wasn't the best kid, and often he would catch me doing something I shouldn't do. And this came true again when I was 17 and a half years old. I disobeyed my dad in a really significant way, and he caught me and confronted me about it. And I think looking back, he could really sense that this was a real crossroads in my life, and I know he really labored over what was the best way to help me make the right decisions, because he could see that I was making a lot of the wrong decisions. So his decision was to punish me, and to punish me in a way that was far more severe than I had expected. He decided that I would be grounded for the next 6 months until I was 18 years old. And then instead of going away on spring break the following week, that I would end up at the office with him, and that I would spend the week with him, and we would spend a lot of time together. So when I realized what kind of level of punishment that he was giving me in this situation, I got pretty mad, and I was really questioning some of the thinking that I had had up to that point, particularly about whether my dad really was the greatest dad in the world or not. And I actually was contemplating leaving home. I felt like it was unfair and that he had made a really bad decision in that case. But as I was contemplating that, my punishment started, and Monday rolled around, and I found myself in my dad's office, sitting down, and I found that he was reading out of the book of Proverbs to me. So I can tell you on those first couple days of the week, I tried not to listen. I tried just to get through those days. But as he continued to read, it became more and more difficult to not listen to what he was reading. If you're familiar with the beginning of the book of Proverbs, pretty much every passage says things like, "Listen, my son, to the teachings of your father." And it was one thing to hear my dad say, "Look, you have to obey what I'm asking you to do." It was another thing to read it in God's Word and know that God was telling me that if I was going to be wise, this was something I needed to do. So as the week progressed, I started to listen more and more and more. And by Wednesday of that week, I decided that I needed to listen to my dad. And as I look back, that was a crossroads in my life, because I decided then to keep listening, and I listened for the rest of my life to my dad. I also decided in that week that I wanted to be like my dad. And I also decided that I actually wanted Christ in my life. By the time that week was over, my dad began to stop being my dad and began to start to be my friend. Over the next 25 years, my dad became the greatest friend in the world. In my 20s and 30s, I would call him. He was on the West Coast, I was on the East Coast. I would call him countless times a week, talking to him, asking his advice, seeing what was going on. I knew those calls were important to him. He always made time for me. It was rare that he wouldn't answer the phone. And there were even times when he was teaching a class and I would call, and he would stop the class and he would answer my call and he would talk to me until I was done talking. I don't know why my dad got sick in his late 50s, but he did. And at times, the level of sickness that he had caused us to question how much longer he would be alive. But somehow he kept plugging along and kept fighting and kept finding ways to get a little better and then a little worse and then a little better. During that time, particularly in the last 5 years, I would call him and talk to him and say, "Dad, you need to move out to New Jersey. You need to get closer so we can keep an eye on you." And he always thanked me, but he didn't take me up on that offer. But about 1.5 years ago, his sickness got bad enough that he finally did. And 13 months ago, my mom and my dad both got off a plane and came to live with us. It was later that fall of last year that we finally got a firm diagnosis as to what my dad had. A doctor called it Lewy body dementia. And it really helped us understand why my dad's body was deteriorating and his mind as well. It helped us understand how to care for him. Despite the Lewy body dementia, my dad had one more important lesson to teach us. Throughout my life, my dad had been a man of great faith. He had always expressed, both in his actions and in his words, and in all aspects of what I knew of him, he had expressed his deep faith in Christ. But as time went by, as he got sicker and sicker, and his mind was less and less clear, and his body was less and less strong, there were only a few things of my dad, the dad that I knew, there were only a few things that survived, and his faith was one of those things. There were times when he could barely get 2 words together in a sentence. He could barely talk, barely find the words to say something. And in those times, I would ask him if he would pray as we sat down to a meal. And he would pray an entire prayer without a break, without missing a word, without searching for the word to say. It was as though he had just prayed more in his life than he had talked. And the only thing that would stop him in those prayers was when he would just get filled with emotion and cry because he felt so strongly about Christ and about praying and about communicating with God. The last week of my dad's life was a tough one. His health declined very quickly, and on Wednesday of that week, we took him to the hospital to see if there was anything that could be done. He was in the hospital for about 24 hours, and they released him without giving us much information about what could be done or what was wrong with him. They just ruled out a few things. So when my mom and I got him home, he was in pretty bad shape. He could barely walk. He really couldn't talk much anymore. But he stopped us when we got home, and he said, "We need to pray." And he prayed right then. I'm so thankful for his example. I'm thankful that he really was the greatest dad in the world. I love you, Dad.